Welcome to Podcast on TechNation. This is a series of podcasts focused specifically on the biomedical and HTM industry. Episodes will be added monthly. Listening to each episode is eligible for 1 CE credit from the ACI. At the conclusion of this episode, you'll be able to access a survey that will appear under this episode's title. You will be able to download your certificate once you submit the survey. Before we begin today's podcast, I'd like to invite you to our fall MD Expo. We will be in Orlando, Florida from October the 29th to the 31st. Registration is now open, so for more information and event details, please visit mdexposhow.com. Podcast on TechNation would like to thank our sponsor, Ordr. Ordr is focused on making connected device security simple through their zero-touch agentless deployment, one common platform for multiple stakeholders, and automation of policies to secure devices. With Ordr, you will know exactly what's connected to the network in real time, all the time. You will know what's vulnerable, what's behaving maliciously, and why. You can then automate response for any connected device and enforce on any networking and security infrastructure. Visit ordr.net for more information. In this episode, we are joined by Ben Stock, Director of Healthcare Product Management at Ordr, and Chris Westfall, Head of Product Marketing at Ordr. And they will be discussing 5 ways HTM Teams can help improve cybersecurity across the whole hospital.
Hi, my name is Chris Westfall, and I head up product marketing here at Ordr. And in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about HTM's role in cybersecurity, and we're going to be covering some things that they can do to improve security really across the whole hospital. And today, I'm joined by Ben Stock. He's our Director of Healthcare Product Management at Ordr. He was previously a Director of Clinical Equipment Systems and Project Support at SSM Health in St. Louis, Missouri. Ben, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So Ben, I'd love to start off by having you share a little bit about your background, because you spent a lot of time in healthcare and HTM specifically, so you have a lot of insights into the topic we're going to be talking about. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've done before you were at Ordr?
Yeah, it's great. It's take a trip back in the Wayback Machine here in the early 2000s. I found myself in a situation where I had started with a technical company outside of right after college. And after, events within the country in the early 2000s, I found myself without a job. So I was looking for something that was really stable. And I figured healthcare was a good fit and that fit my skill set. By degree, I'm an electronics engineer, went through a lot of design and, building of electronic circuits and so forth. So within healthcare, biomed seemed like a really good fit. I sometimes refer to myself as an accidental biomed because I had no intention at any point in my life to ever be a biomed. And I think you'll find that's a pretty common thing within the industry. So I started out, over 20 years ago as a BMET 1, working on things like infusion pumps, patient monitors, doing installation of those things within the healthcare environment. And then I began to work my way up. I became a CBET. I got my certification and passed all the tests for that. And then worked up to a BMET 2, started doing some field service work within my organization, became a BMET 3, did some OR surgical center stuff with that. And then I started working on imaging equipment, and that's really where the networking and cyber and just the overall connected equipment came in as part of my job. Eventually, I moved up into to a management role, and then became the director over capital acquisition and cybersecurity, which doesn't necessarily seem to go well together. But when you really look at it, where cybersecurity starts is making good purchasing decisions and making sure you're purchasing the equipment that's going to be safe from vendors that are doing their best to do that as well.
So yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've got a great background, and you've been able to see a lot of different facets of the role. So you have perspective, I think, at different points, from practitioner up to acquisition and doing some management as well. But I'd love to hear from you over your 15 years or so. How did that role of HTM or biomed change, especially when it comes to cybersecurity? How do you see the importance and the focus on cybersecurity changed from when you started to, to where it is now?
Yeah, great question. 20 years ago, it really wasn't a thing. A lot of the devices, if they were networks, they were on kind of their own segmented networks, and they didn't really get exposed that much to the overall, hospital network. They didn't have internet access. And when we really started to see that change was when we saw the Healthcare Act passed, and they were pushing healthcare organizations to go to this electronic medical record. With that, it opened up the opportunity for a lot of the equipment that we used on a daily basis to be integrated with that electronic healthcare record for multiple different reasons. It reduced, human error. It also increased the profits for the health systems, that everything that was chargeable was getting noted. And then it was also a great patient safety thing, because you took a lot of human error out of things like programming infusion pumps, or making sure that, the doctor wrote a 2 and not a 5 on the script. It's much easier when it's in the form of an electronic record. So we saw that. It would have probably been about 10 to 12 years ago, where that really started to kick in, and more devices outside of imaging started to get connected to the network.
So, it sounds like the technology kind of led the way there with, like you said, more things being connected and more things online with EHR. How did you adapt in that role? How did you kind of evolve your security capabilities?
Yeah, so I had a fairly extensive computer background with the imaging side of it, and just personal life. But I studied and learned about all the different types of attacks, and all the ways that the devices were connecting into the healthcare network. And I worked with my cyber teams, my cybersecurity team, who didn't really understand the medical device side, and their solution to everything was just, well, if it's not safe, just take it off the network. But if it can't be, it needs to be on the network to deliver patient care. It's not really an option. So we worked together to make sure that we were providing enough security for the devices, but then also making sure we didn't impact patient care along the way.
Yeah, which is super important. I think, you identified what is, sometimes a common gap in knowledge, where you've got security on one side trying to do what's best to protect the organization. You have your biomeds on the other side trying to ensure patient safety and availability and all those things. And sometimes those can be, opposing forces, but I think good relationships definitely help there. Do you have any recommendations or advice for folks that are in that role and want to get better, want to get started with security? What are some things they might do, or places they might go?
Yeah, there's a lot of online resources. Amy actually has a cyber program. I think it's available at no cost if you're an Amy member, which it does have a cost to it. But they have a really good beginning cyber program that kind of goes over some of the things like the NIST framework, and how to implement best practices related to healthcare and medical devices. That's a great resource. There's a lot of other solutions out there. If you just search them, the wealth of knowledge out there compared to just a number of years ago is extensive. And I would definitely start with Amy, and then work from there.
Yeah, I think obviously there's a lot of focus on cybersecurity in general, especially in healthcare. And like you said, there's a ton of resources if people want to get started or even get smarter about security. There are a whole bunch of resources out there. One thing you can do is obviously make a good connection and have good relationships with your security team, and that hopefully goes a long way in helping collaboration and things like that. But let's talk a little bit about structure. I'd love to hear, when you were in your role at SSM, how things were structured, who did you report to, and where do you think this biomed role, or this the management and security of these devices, where do you think that should report to?
Yeah, let's talk about what we see in the industry these days. And typically, you're going to see the HTM or biomed clinical engineering department report up to 3 different places. It's either going to report up to facilities, to supply chain, or to your IT leadership. Historically, biomed programs came out of the facilities, where they found a need for someone to work on more advanced equipment than your air handlers and so forth. So in that aspect, biomed was born out of facilities like this cyber The cyber biomed work has been born out of general biomeds in the most part. So you see some of the older organizations that have been around a while will still report up through facilities. You'll see some newer ones that report up through supply chain. Acquisition of equipment is also a big part of biomed, so that does kind of play well together also. But the one we're seeing that is working the best and is getting to be the most common is where your IT leadership and your biomed leadership usually report up to one person at the top. But then those teams work very well together because they are so intertwined within the health system. With a majority of your wireless devices in the hospital are medical devices at this point in time. So if you're integrated infusion pumps, that is a majority of what's on your wireless network at most healthcare systems. So with that, working together and having an infrastructure where your HTM and your IT security, network services all report up at least to the one person at the top seems to work the best from what I've seen of all those options.
Yeah, and I think regardless of where you report today or where how your organization might change in the future, one thing that you mentioned is that collaboration, that working between teams is key, right? You can't do this in a silo. I think we see that in healthcare and other organizations as well. There's a lot of different kind of facets and things to consider as you're managing devices, ensuring availability, ensuring security. Security is really across the whole organization. You can't do it in a bubble. I'd love to talk about some things that HTM teams or biomed teams can do to help when it comes to security. They do a lot of things day to day, and sometimes we all do things that we don't think about the bigger picture. But I'd love to talk about some of those things and see how they might contribute to. We oftentimes talk about whole hospital security. Starting off, I think we'll start off with a real easy one. One thing that HTM is doing today, and that is asset inventory. Can you talk a little bit about how you did that and how you see this being done, some of the challenges and maybe some of the tips and tricks?
Sure, and asset inventory is one that the clinical engineering HTM has been doing for years, and it's actually regulated. Depending on what your commissioning body is for your health system, if it's joint commission with reporting up to CMMS, they say you have to keep an accurate inventory of all your medical devices. That's from the otoscope on the wall in the doctor's office up through your MRIs and your CTs. All have to be inventoried in one way, shape, or form. Where we differ is those devices that are more complex. They require more than just a basic inventory. It's more than a manufacturer, model name number, and a serial number to keep them inventory properly. You need to know how those devices are connecting to the network, key pieces of information about them, IP address, MAC address, what subnet they're on, any restrictions that they have on the network, who they should be talking to, who they shouldn't be talking to. And these things go outside of the realm of what a typical biomed asset inventory would be. So we need tools to record those things, and we need to be able to collect them for the devices that are coming in, and also any legacy devices that we may have failed to collect that when they were put into service. So with that comes back to that collaboration that you talked about between teams. If that stuff's already out on the network, there's a couple ways that you can gather that. Networking and IT do have some tools that pull in all the different information about the devices that are connected to the network. You can get simple things like IP, MAC address, and stuff without physically going in front of those machines. But if you don't have those resources or you can't exactly figure it out, a lot of times these are manual efforts of the people that are the subject matter experts on those devices, going out, taking those devices away from the caregivers at that point in time, hopefully scheduled, to gather that additional information to make sure that they have a complete asset inventory, including all those very important IT fields that we should be capturing for those devices.
Yeah, and like you said, I think tools are definitely the way to go, especially in a larger organization, because things change, right? I mean, you have new devices added to the network, even devices that are legacy or that have been, in your environment for years, may change. Something that that is mobile, like an infusion pump, could change IP addresses, right? And that's going to create some challenges. I think leveraging tools to automate this to some extent is definitely helpful, rather than the manual task of running around with a clipboard.
Yeah, and the good thing with leveraging tools is you're also catching things that you may not know existed in the first place. So, there was a big assumption on my part there is that you know about that device already and you have some basic information. But we find ourselves in lots of situations where devices have come into health systems where no one, the people that needed to know about them didn't. Someone put in a rec and it made it through IT without IT letting Biomed know, and it got on the network. And we didn't even know the device existed. So you can only rely on what you think you have so much. You really need to start asking what is out there, 100% proven. We've seen it on the network, and make sure that inventory matches up to what's actually there.
I think that's key, because there are always I'll say known unknowns on the network, right? I think that's a gap that is common, that people are always trying to close. And you talked about some automation capabilities. I can think of two classes of automation. One would be active, where you're maybe doing something like a scan on a regular basis or scheduled. And the other way is passive. Can you talk a little bit about both and what maybe some of the pros and cons might be for those?
Sure. So active could be broken down into two categories. One would be, that scanning of the network, using some form of a scanner that goes out and says, hey, I found an IP address, and then attempting to access it in multiple ways to try and determine what it is. And then there's also an agent-based approach, which generally isn't used within medical devices, because those agents would have to be approved by the manufacturer, or the organization would have to assume the risk of installing it on the device. The problem with both of those is one, you're putting something on a medical device that opens you up to liability, and you have to be very comfortable that you're safe when you're doing that. And two is, if you're actively going at the device to try to get some information back, a lot of these devices aren't designed to accept that kind of interrogation, and it could cause an issue where that device would go offline or lose network connectivity.
It's definitely something you don't want to risk if it's a device that's in the middle of a study or a procedure where it might impact the that particular procedure or impact patient safety. The other way to do it is with passive methods. Can you talk a little bit about what a passive method might look like and how that would kind of overcome some of the limitations of the two that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So passively, what we would do is we would do a couple. There's a couple different ways to look at the data. The most typical is to look at a span port where the information that's traversing the network is duplicated, so you're not impacting anything that is actively in use on the network. And then using deep packet inspection to determine what the devices are on both sides of the communication, depending on whether the information is encrypted or not, looking at the information within the packets to determine what the device is on both ends, what protocols they're talking with. If they're using DICOM, if it's an imaging device, you can see things like the AE title, your IP address and all that information, along with the port that they're communicating on. Those are all very important pieces of information to help identify how the device is communicating. But a lot of times it'll also include the manufacturer, the model number, allowing us to identify what devices are on both sides of that communication. And if you do this over time and gather more and more information, you can be more confident that you're identifying the device very accurately as to what it is.
Well, and the other thing is that if you're doing this on a regular basis or a continuous basis, not only are you improving accuracy, but you're improving accuracy, as far as depth of details go, but also you're creating sort of a real-time view of these devices, right? Because if something gets plugged into the network or changes an IP address, for example, if you're analyzing that network data, you should be able to catch that.
Correct. Yeah, and you're basically creating a profile of what this device should do and how it typically communicates, and that allows you to do a lot of different things. It allows you to monitor it for deviations from that. So if there was an event and someone was trying to reach out to that device that had never been before, you could flag that piece of information, or that device started reaching out to things that it had never talked to before. You can also to look at that communication. And this additional information, and we probably won't go down this path, allows you to do things like segmentation and make sure that when you do segment the devices, they're allowed to communicate with the devices that they have to provide that patient care.
And I think this, asset inventory is foundational. Really, visibility of what you have on the network is foundational for anything when it comes to security. It's a requirement in healthcare. Just knowing what's on the network or knowing what assets you have is required for compliance. But I want to point out that this is, and I'm kind of jumping ahead or giving a sneak peek to some of the things that we'll cover in a little bit later, but this is a great way for you not only to kind of tick that box for asset inventory, but also create a foundation of very rich insight that's important for security. Not only are you able to potentially provide more granular detail, but as Ben alluded to, you also can provide some of the insights as far as device communications go that are super critical to your security and network teams when it comes to creating things like segmentation policy. So as you think higher level and you think about how your organization is trying to protect itself across the whole hospital, this is a foundational piece that's going to be critical as they start to think about the strategy and implement policy.
Yeah, and you made me think of something while you're talking there is as part of that asset inventory is identifying the person that is the the key person responsible or the key department that's responsible for supporting that device and that also owns that device. And not only identifying them, but making sure that information is available to the other teams. Because if there is an event and the only thing the security team or the networking team knows is an IP or a MAC address, they need to be able to quickly identify what that device is, either utilizing their tools or by having access to whatever database you're using to record this information, and then be able to contact the person that's responsible for it. Because if there is an event occurring, seconds are hours on the back end of recreating what's happening with that event. And the sooner they can determine what the device is and if they can isolate it, the quicker they can find a resolution to the event.
Yeah, so not only does this create that foundational view and help security do things that are a little bit more proactive, but it also helps with some of the collaboration, which I think is great, right? You would love for security, if there's an incident, for security to pick up the phone and collaborate with the device owner to ensure that the right action is taken, that you're not impacting anything in a negative way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know a lot of these, we talk about scanning tools, proactive and or active and passive tools, but I think one thing you mentioned is having a database or a repository where all this information lives. So it's super important that you not only can collect this detail, but also enrich the tools that you have. If it's a CMMS or a CMDB, wherever you centralize that asset inventory, I think that's a crucial step, is making sure that not only is it something that you on the HTM and biomed teams can access, but also something that is usable or accessible to other IT teams, security teams, networking teams, because it's going to make a lot of processes a lot more efficient.
Yeah. And, I think we're all guilty of a little bit of tool overload. Everybody sees a problem and they buy a tool to fix that particular problem. But organizations need to determine one key tool that has a list of everything. ServiceNow is a great tool for that, but there's other ones out there. But the thing they have to understand is they have to make sure that they at least have key pieces of information about everything on the network that can at least lead them in the right direction. And they don't have to go through and check 5 tools before they find the piece of the particular information that they're looking for.
Yep. And the best case scenario, everything should be, I think, really enriching the various tools that you have in your environment, right? You should have a sort of a single source of truth, and that single source of truth can hopefully make everything else smarter, or at least centralize that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next on the list here is vulnerability management. And that's a couple of, managing vulnerabilities is not only knowing what's vulnerable, but knowing the actual risk. Is it something that can be exploited in my environment? And what is the sort of the threat level of that risk? With the right asset inventory, you have a really rich foundation of device knowledge, so you can start to answer some of these questions. But Ben, can you talk a little bit about vulnerability management and the role HTMs play in managing vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even HTM. This is a problem across the entire hospital. Fortunately, though, general IT, usually this can be addressed with patches, and they have a regular patching cycle. And if there's an emergency, they can patch, more quickly than the scheduled events. But with healthcare and medical devices, it gets a little more complicated. You can't necessarily just start pushing patches out to these devices. And then some of them are running, non-traditional operating systems or proprietary operating systems that were built by the manufacturers. So like you said, knowing what you have is the first key there, making sure that you have an accurate inventory of the model, manufacturer, and the software revision, which is one I didn't talk about when we were doing the asset portion of it. But knowing that software revision is the difference between you looking at an alert and saying, oh, that doesn't affect us. But not knowing means you have to go out and find that device again to identify what the software revision is to see if the alert is relevant for that particular device or not. So once you have that knowledge about what the device is, what operating system and software version it's running, you can then use that with either a tool like ECRI or what used to be Rasmus is now Recall One, and it can bounce that off their database, or you can use a tool that may do it automatically for you, where it says, hey, we know what you have, and we want to go out and look at the FDA database and see which of these alerts are relevant to your devices. But once you have all that information, it really is an effort to determine what to do at that point in time. If you're running an outdated operating system and the manufacturer doesn't really offer any way to get you up to a current one that has patches available, you can't necessarily replace that piece of equipment. It could be a portable ultrasound that may be $30,000 to $60,000 to replace, or it could be an MRI that's $1 million plus to replace. Those kind of things are where you have to evaluate the risk of those, look for alternative methods to protect those devices until they can be replaced with a device that is more up to date and has a more up to date operating system. But the problem is that one's going to run out too before you can replace it. So we really have to keep an accurate inventory, know what is vulnerable, and then know, like you said, what vulnerabilities are exploitable. So if you have a vulnerability that is theoretically exploitable but has never been, they have never figured out a way to exploit it, it's a much lower risk than ones that have active exploits available for them and people actively going out and trying to find and use these vulnerabilities on the machines. And you have to prioritize those based on those ones that are known to be actively vulnerable and have active exploits. Protect those first, and then work down the list and get the rest of them.
I think prioritization is key, but it can be a difficult thing to do, right? Because you need to take into consideration not only, is a device vulnerable, is that vulnerability exploitable, but other factors of that device. How at risk is that device from other types of attacks, in addition to really understanding the role of that device in your organization. Because a device, maybe say a security camera that is vulnerable, you might be able to take that offline, whereas an MRI is not something you can just take offline very easily. So, again, going back to that asset inventory, the more insights you have in that inventory, the better positioned you are to make decisions about prioritization and make decisions about how you're going to address that vulnerability. If it's remediation where you're getting rid of the vulnerability altogether, patching, upgrading, or applying some mitigation, either isolating, quarantining that device, taking it offline, or something a little bit more advanced would be applying something like segmentation, where you would collaborate with your security and networking teams to isolate that device down to its essential communications, keep that device online, but really reduce the what we call the attack surface or the exploitability of any vulnerability. So again, the more you know about that device, the better position you are to make the right decisions and take action. The more in control you are, I guess, over your actions.
Yeah, Chris, there's no one size fits all to any situation.
Right.
And that's where having someone that knows your infrastructure, knows how these devices are being used is so critical. And if you look at something like infusion pumps, there's not an infusion pump out right now that doesn't have some form of a recall or a notice open on it. It's part of the solutions. They're inherently used within healthcare, and they have some flaws that all of them are dealing with. But if you look at it, and there's a device, and it has an open recall on it that is an open vulnerability that can be exploited externally through the network, and you really have to understand how those devices are being used within your healthcare system. If they're connected to wireless network and they're only online to receive library updates that happen, on a biannual basis, it may not make sense for your organization to keep those devices on the network until that's resolved. But you could have the same exact devices, and you could have them connected to your electronic health record for interoperability, and they're receiving not only drug libraries much more regularly, but they're also receiving the patient orders and the infusion rates and all the stuff that make the pump do what it's supposed to do through your network. And your nurses have been doing this for 2 years, and that's how they know how to do it. The risk to the patient care may be greater than pulling them off the, if you pull them off the network and they had to be manually programmed, you may determine that risk is too high, and you want to look at some other way to protect the devices. And that's when we get into those alternative methods, like you mentioned, like segmentation, making sure that no external sources can reach that pump that aren't required for it to perform the patient care that it needs, really cuts that risk of those vulnerabilities down to almost zero.
Well, and I think this leads into our next point, which is improving collaboration. Security is not something that any one team can really do in isolation or in a silo. You gave a great example of where, the insight that and knowledge that the biomed knows, about that device and its role and what it does and how it needs to communicate. All those subtleties are something that, a security team might not be privy to, or they just don't have that level of detail. And that's where, you provide that insight to know exactly what that device should be doing and how critical it is. And you have a, seat at the table, basically, to help with the, if we have to apply a mitigation, you should have a seat at the table, to suggesting what that mitigation should be. But, back to this next point, it's really about improving collaboration. So again, you can't do this in isolation. You need to be working, I think, with the security teams at the very least to, to help improve security. Can you talk a little bit about that, Ben?
Yeah, the one example I like to look at is that they need to work with you and you need to work with them. So you're going to expect certain things from security at some point in time, and they're also going to come to you with things. My best advice on this topic is when security or anyone from IT comes to you, set a high priority on that. Show them that you care about their requests and that you expect that in return. So by showing them that you're going to put their requests as a high priority, you understand that this means something to them if they've come to you for this assistance, and making sure you react promptly to their requests, they should start responding promptly to your requests as well. Build that relationship, have regular meetings. They don't have to be every week. You could have a monthly or a quarterly meeting, but where you guys everybody lays their cards on the table and says, this is where we're struggling, we're asking for help here and we're not getting it, from both sides. But really improving how the two teams communicate, whether it's IT or parts of IT, and biomed, can go a long way to helping with the security posture of your organization.
Yeah, I think, oftentimes a big hindrance there in any organization is that, these teams, to some respect, speak different languages, right? Maybe there's some apprehension to engage with the security team because you don't always see eye to eye. You don't always have the information, maybe in the structure or the language that the other teams kind of expect. So I think going back again to the earlier point of using tools to not only address the asset inventory requirement, but to gather granular details about the device, about its role in the environment, its communications, how it's connected to the environment. It helps to answer some of those questions and helps to put HTM and biomed on sort of on the same level as security, and I think can help a lot with the collaboration. But ultimately, you can't do this yourself. They can't do it in isolation. You really need to work together. and find a way to do that efficiently, because the benefits could really be massive.
Yeah, and I think the one tool that is forgotten about the most these days is the telephone. Sometimes when you don't understand, you just got to pick up a phone and start asking questions, because emails lose context a lot, and you may think you know exactly what's going on, and you go down one path, and it's very frustrating because you've now wasted time, when a simple 5-minute phone call could have resolved most of the issues, and it may not even have been an issue at all. So don't hesitate to have that communication path and be able to pick up the phone and talk to your colleagues. And I have not experienced this, but I've heard it through the grapevine post COVID. Some IT is now working from home, so it's even more important at that time, when you can't see them in the cafeteria or running them through the hallway, to pick up the phone and have those conversations when you have questions about what's going on.
Yep. Yeah. Phone or Zoom, or even, schedule some time to have lunch, or anything. I think having those relationships, obviously, I know when I've talked to somebody live, or seen them in person, it really helps with the work relationship and getting stuff done. So I think that's super critical. Well, again, moving on to the next point here. Again, security is not something that can be done by any one team. It can't even be done by a single organization. Oftentimes, as an organization, you depend on security vendors to help you. Obviously, you depend on security vendors to help protect your environment. Also, vendors, device manufacturers, I think, are an important pillar when it comes to security. So one thing I want to talk about is holding vendors accountable, and what that means, and what your expectations should be for a vendor. So Ben, can you provide some insight there on what you would expect from a vendor today?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's start with the context that vendors inherently want to deliver a good product that is a secure product, and that delivers patient care, and while making a little bit of money doing it. That's we got to remember, they are there to make money. So when they develop a product, that product has a life cycle. When a hospital purchases a product, it has an expected life expectancy. And a manufacturer, when they develop a product, they're looking to get 10 plus years out of that product life cycle, so selling it for quite a while. And when an organization buys a product, it's 5 years for cheap products, but it's 10 to 15 years for some of the more expensive products. And the problem with this is that the products, the operating systems that run on a lot of these, have a much faster life cycle than the products themselves. So they're around 10, 15 years, when an operating system, from inception to writing it off is usually at max about 7 years. So vendors have to have a product lifecycle plan that includes things like upgrading to the most recent operating system, building in security features that last the entirety of the product. And this is a big ask, because we don't know what's coming up 10 years from now, but they need to be more flexible and have the ability to adapt their products to the changing environment without having to reissue an entirely new product. And what we can do to hold them accountable for this is, when we're buying equipment, we need to make sure that they've built in these types of features into the product. So that we are running them through a security checklist and making sure they're doing everything they can at this point in time to meet the security needs of the organization. But then they also have a plan going forward to keep meeting those needs. And the vendors that are doing this best are the ones we should be buying the equipment from. So the ones that aren't, they won't sell as much, and they'll look to do better. Why is vendor X selling more MRIs than we are? Well, they have a plan to secure these devices in the future, and we don't. And when your sales starts reporting that back to engineering, they're going to fix those types of problems. We can look at things like the MDS2 documentation, which has come a long way. It's been out for about 10 years now at this point in time, but it's still not perfect. Manufacturers spell their name different ways on every single one, which makes it very difficult to index and search those things. What information they put in different sections is different, even within the same manufacturer, from product to product. So getting those things standardized to where they can be easier used by the health systems and products that utilize them would go a long way. This year, they've signed into law that when any new equipment that files for FDA 510K requires an SBOM, which is a software bill of materials. It's kind of a recipe of all the different pieces of software that go into these devices. This is an absolute great step forward because this is information we didn't have before. But the same thing that goes to be said about the MDS2, it's taken 10 years to get this far. It's going to take a long time for the software bill of materials to get up to a level where it is really usable by organizations to make decisions. So we have a long way before that really kicks in and we see the fruits of those labors. And we also have a lot of legacy equipment that they're not going to be required for. But we can also gather that information on our own. We can push the vendors to, since now they have to do it for new equipment, maybe supply that for some of your older equipment. And with that information, we can react much quicker to things like zero-day events. The last one, oh, I'm blanking here. What did we go through in December, Chris? It was
we went through the OpenSSL bug, I believe.
Yeah, and it was related to Java, and it was if you had certain versions of Java on your device that you could be susceptible to this. Well, we don't have an inventory of what all medical devices have this particular version of Java on it. If you had an SBOM for those, you could quickly index that and say, okay, I've got these 10 pieces of equipment that are susceptible to this because they have this application on them. With that, you don't have to wait weeks for the manufacturer to come out and say, oh yeah, you are susceptible to that, you should be doing something about it. So this is, this goes to that whole knowing and your knowledge is power thing that we talked about with asset inventory, with vulnerabilities. The more you know about the devices, the better you can protect them.
Yep. And this is, I think, to kind of summarize, transparency and response of vendors is critical. And this is something where you can definitely vote with your budget and help to influence those vendors and really, almost reward those vendors that are performing the way you need them to protect your environment. And so with that, I think that's a good segue to the last point I want to make here, which is the thought of, as an HTM, expanding your influence. We just talked about it in the context of vendors, but really internally in your organization, we talked about asset inventory, knowing about vulnerabilities, improving collaborations. You have a lot of knowledge about a critical part of the hospital, being the medical devices. And when it comes to, sort of a larger strategic view or larger strategy, planning and executing and implementing that strategy to improve security, you should have a seat at the table. You have critical information, you have critical insights, you're an important part of the operations. And I think that's something where HTM teams can really step up and provide that information proactively to help improve things. But Ben, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think there's two key areas here. They're a little different, but are both expanding your influence within the organization. One speaks to that purchasing and speaking with your dollars. The clinical engineering biomed HTM program should be inserted into the capital acquisition program, especially for medical devices or anything that they are going to be responsible for taking care of, that they have to know is going to show up and be implemented. And part of the process for both picking what devices are being purchased, but then also signing off when those dollars are ultimately sent to the vendor to make the purchase, so that they have an idea of when those devices are coming in, when they can expect them, have the right resources and staffing to implement them properly. The second would be expand your influence within the C-suite. And I've been in many hospitals, and it's a typical experience to find your biomed department in the basement and your IT department in the carpeted area across from the C-suite and the executives, and they seem to always have a little more influence. Biomed should be right in there, making sure that our concerns are being heard, what we need to do to make these medical devices safer for the patients and for the end users. And for the health system in general, is being heard by the C-suite and those that need to hear what needs to be done to keep everything safe in the future.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ben. I really appreciate you taking the time to, to have this conversation today. I think, given your background and your area of focus here at Ordr, you've definitely seen a lot of different organizations, those that are, quite advanced to those that are just getting started and everything in between. So hopefully this, what we covered today was useful to the audience. Just to kind of recap, I think, we covered 5 things where HTM really plays a part in and can contribute to the security and improvement of security in their organization. First is asset inventory, really getting a good handle on everything that's connected in your environment. And that goes beyond just knowing, MAC address, a serial number, IP address, and knowing as much information about that device as possible. And that includes how the device is connected and communicating on the network. And this segues into the next point, which is knowing about vulnerabilities, which is not only knowing a vulnerability exists and a device has a vulnerability, but how exploitable is it? In addition to how critical is this device in my organization? It helps you with that knowledge. It helps you to make the right decision as you're planning remediations or mitigation steps. The more information you have, the better positioned you are to make the right decision. Next, we covered improving collaboration, and this is really identifying and working with your peers on the security team. And this helps not only with addressing things like vulnerabilities, but also applying those mitigations in addition to addressing say real-time threats. If there's an issue, if there's an attack, you want the security team to pick up the phone and call you as a device owner so that they're doing the right thing that not only stops the attack, but helps to ensure that we're not impacting patient safety or hospital operations. Next up, we covered why holding vendors accountable, why that's important and what you can do there. And then finally, what we just covered was expanding your influence with all this great, rich information and knowledge you have of the medical devices. You're in a great position to be part of those strategic conversations and to be part of the planning as organizations look to get better or proactively protect their environment with things like zero trust, segmentation, network access control, what have you. You play an important role and you should play an important role in those conversations. But Ben, again, thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate your insights and look forward to talking to you again on another one of these podcasts.
It's a great summary, Chris. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ben and Chris, for a great presentation. If you enjoyed today's episode, you might enjoy our ongoing webinar series, Webinar Wednesday. You can find a calendar of upcoming live webinars, as well as an archive of on-demand webinars at webinarwednesday.live. To obtain your certificate for 1CE credit from the ACI, please remember to complete and submit the survey form located below this podcast title. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com.